This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Hi, everybody. It's True Crime Arizona host Brianna Whitney. I'm here with Morgan Lowe, and we are finally at the end of the Zombie Hunter trial chapter of this podcast. Bryan Patrick Miller was recently sentenced for the murders, the Canal Murders of Angela Barrasso and Melanie Bernis. And Morgan, this is what we've been waiting for now for 8 months.
8 months of testimony and trial. And Brianna, you were in the courtroom for the sentencing. I was not there, but from what I hear, it was a lot different in the courtroom on this day than it was the days before.
Yeah, when I got up the stairs or up the elevator to the courtroom just outside of it, there was a sea of people there. There were friends of the victims. There were advocates. The Bernis family was there. There was a slew of media. I've never seen that many people waiting to get into a courtroom, and there wasn't even enough seats for everybody in there. So it was a packed house because people knew this was important.
Yeah, on any given normal day during this trial, there might have been 9 people maybe in the audience section, the public section of the courtroom. So was there a palpable feeling of tension in the air? What did it feel like? What did it look like?
It was very quiet. I can tell you, I was nervous. Just, we had seen all of this testimony for months. You knew that this was a major decision that was coming down from the judge. And I could feel that same kind of nervous energy, that anxiety from everybody in the courtroom, no matter who they were. The Bernis family was very quiet. They all sat together in the front row. You had a lot of journalists that were waiting for this, and a lot of us have been covering this case for years, so you knew this was a long time coming. And even court staff, it was so quiet because everybody was waiting in anticipation of what the judge was going to say. And she started up relatively quick. She came out and launched into an explanation, so to speak. And I know in the last podcast you and I talked about, we didn't know if she was going to explain her decision or just come out and say sentenced to death or sentenced to life in prison. And I thought it was pretty interesting what she said and the amount of thought she put into what she told the court and everybody there.
So let's play some of that sound. Let's play that part of this sentencing so that our listeners can hear what was said as it was said.
The defendant, Bryan Miller, murdered Melanie and Angela and committed other horrific crimes upon them, and the court found him guilty as charged. In her victim impact statement, Melanie's sister Jill said that for anyone tuning in after the second week of trial, one would have thought the defendant was the victim. She is not wrong. The what that happened to Angela and Melanie has never been in dispute. The focus from day one of this trial has been why they were so brutally murdered, and what is the appropriate penalty under the particular circumstances of this case and this defendant. Even though the focus has been on the why, this court has never lost sight of what happened to Angela and Melanie 30 years ago. The court appreciates that hearing all of this evidence must have been incredibly difficult for Angela and Melanie's families, and Jill's comment is certainly understandable. And the court emphasizes with the victims' families. In our system of justice, however, when the state is seeking the ultimate penalty, a death sentence, much of the focus must be on whether the defendant is legally or morally meets the criteria for this ultimate penalty. Angela was almost 22, an excellent student, loved by her family and friends. She had a job she loved and a boyfriend who cared for her. She went for a bike ride the night before her birthday alone because her boyfriend was baking her birthday cake. Angela had her whole life ahead of her. Melanie was 17, a high school student with high hopes for her future who stood up for kids who were bullied. Ironically, Melanie probably would have befriended the defendant had they been at school at the same time. Both of these young women are sorely missed. The court found 3 aggravating factors proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The defendant kidnapped and murdered 2 young women. He had sex with them after they were dead. The heinousness and depravity of these murders was beyond the pale. Angela died relatively quickly after the defendant stabbed her, and the evidence shows the defendant sexually assaulted her after she died. The defendant mutilated Angela's body by inflicting numerous wounds, including opening her torso from her body, from her neck to her pelvis, and around her entire torso. He then removed her head and carried it for some distance before discarding it in the canal. Less than 1 year later, the defendant murdered Melanie. She too died very quickly. He cut into her body, making incisions on her breasts and neck and carving initials onto her chest. The evidence shows that, as he did with Angela, the defendant sexually assaulted Melanie after she died. He removed her clothes, dressed her in a bodysuit, and then discarded Melanie into the canal when he was done. The heinousness and depravity surrounding these 2 young women's murders is clearly beyond the pale. The defendant did not just murder them, he brutalized them, and he evaded capture for over 20 years. There is no question that what the defendant did deserves the death penalty. But the court's analysis does not end with what he did. The court must consider the who behind the actions. The court must consider any relevant mitigating evidence of the background, character, propensity, and record of the defendant, as well as the circumstances of the crime. The court has written a special verdict that is 24 pages long and will not read it here, but will be made part of the record. The court summarizes its findings here. The court has considered the statutory mitigating factors that apply: the defendant's age and significant impairment. The defendant was 20 and almost 21 when he committed these murders. This court recognizes his executive functioning was still developing, and his decision-making would have been affected because of his young age at the time. The court also recognized that the defendant was less mature than perhaps a typical 20-year-old. However, the defendant did not steal a car and go joyriding. He planned and executed the murder and sexual assault of 2 women 10 months apart. That being said, the court finds that the defendant has proven his age is a mitigating factor. To determine if the defendant could appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct or conform his conduct to the requirements of law, the court has considered all of the evidence presented by experts as well as lay witnesses. To instruct the court as to whether the defendant could appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct, the court looked at the surrounding circumstances of when the defendant stabbed Celeste Bentley in May of 1989. This was 3 to 4 years before these murders. The defendant clearly appreciated the wrongfulness of his conduct at that time, as demonstrated by his running away after he stabbed her, his changing clothes after he ran, getting rid of the weapon, lying to police, and then more recently claiming remorse. This court has also considered these murders themselves. The defendant acted to conceal his crimes. After he murdered Melanie, he similarly behaved in a way that can be inferred he knew what he did was wrong. For example, he lied to his roommate about where he was on the night of the murder. More recently, when arrested, the defendant denied being familiar with the areas on the canal where the murders were committed, even though he used to ride his bike through there. As far as being able to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law, the court looks to the defendant's life. He was consistently described as a nonviolent, shy child and teenager. His act of violence against Celeste Bentley seemed at the time to be an outlier. Once he left Adobe and entered the AIM-RIGHT program, the defendant was considered a trusted friend and good worker. He proved himself as someone who could be counted on. He struggled with self-care, but there were no instances of violence. Since 2002, there is no evidence that the defendant has been anything other than a law-abiding citizen who was trying to raise his child the best way he knew how. The defendant presented many mental health diagnoses. As more fully fleshed out in the court's special verdict, the court finds as proven by a preponderance of the evidence only the following: depression, anxiety, hoarding, and sexual sadism. The court has considered evidence as rebuttal to the proffered mitigation and not as an additional aggravating factor that the defendant is a sexual sadist. There was conflicting expert testimony proffered as to why the defendant is a sexual sadist. The defendant argues his mother's actions made him a sexual sadist because her abuse fused violence and sex. On the other hand, the state's expert opined there is no research to support why or how a person becomes a sexual sadist. What the evidence does support is that the defendant's sexual sadism existed from early teens even up to his arrest, as evidenced by the Barbie doll incident, the plan, the letters to Amy, Amy's testimony about their sexual relationship, the notebooks the defendant had he and Amy write in, the defendant's continued viewing of violent sadistic pornography. Indeed, the defendant has admitted he finds sexual violence arousing. Based on all of the evidence presented, the court does not find that the defendant has proved beyond a preponderance of the evidence that he is or was substantially impaired as defined. The court is not limited to the statutory mitigating factors. The court may consider anything as a mitigating factor, noticed or not. In its special verdict, the court addresses all 86 noticed mitigating factors. Unusually, the court has evidence of 30 years of the defendant's life since he murdered Angela and Melanie. Since the murders, the defendant married, raised a child, divorced, worked, made lasting friendships, and had other romantic relationships. The defendant has family and friends that support him and will continue to support him. His life must be looked at in total. The defendant listed 29 specific mitigating factors that fall under the category of childhood abuse. The court was presented a plethora of evidence of the defendant's abuse as a child at the hands of his mother, Ellen. The abuse was physical, emotional, and psychological. The abuse seemed to start when the defendant was 5, and according to the defendant, physical abuse continued until he was 15. Also, according to the defendant, the verbal abuse continued until he was 18. The court finds that the defendant is not a reliable reporter. The court looks to various examples of conflicting statements to support this finding. As stated previously, the defendant made multiple conflicting statements about Celeste Bentley's stabbing. When interviewed in 2015, he denied to the police that he was familiar with the Canal area where the murders took place. The defendant disingenuously stated to Serafina that Amy liked violent sex and it was she who liked knives, not him. The defendant even claimed at one time that perhaps it was his mother who wrote the plan, and he denied remembering it. The defendant also minimized his interest in sadistic pornography. Defendant's disclosures to experts about his abuse during trial preparation could be considered inherently untrustworthy. However, the defendant did share with others in his life prior to being arrested that he was abused. The defendant understandably did not share a lot of those details of his abuse with those people in his life. The defendant eventually, through help from the church, forgave his mother. The court does find there was corroborating testimony about the abuse that he suffered at the hands of his mother from third parties. This is outlined more fully in the court's special verdict. What was clear from all of the testimony that Ellen was not a loving and nurturing mother. She was inappropriate and crossed boundaries. She was hateful, cruel, and controlling. While the court does not find that the defendant proved every one of the 29 subcategories of abuse, the defendant's abuse as a child was proven by a preponderance of the evidence. With all of the mitigating circumstances proven, the court finds that the defendant's age at the time of the murders and the abuse that he suffered at the hands of his mother carry the most weight. The court has considered the quality and strength of all of the mitigating circumstances, as well as the facts and circumstances of this case, the brutality of these two murders. The question the court must answer is if the totality of the mitigation is sufficiently substantial to call for leniency. The answer is no. The court, upon my oath, finds, having considered all of the facts and circumstances of the case, that the defendant should be sentenced to death on counts 1 and 2.
Death. Not a huge surprise to our podcast listeners. It was not a huge surprise to us. So after Judge Suzanne Cohen announced that, they took a break.
Yeah.
And there were still the other charges he needed to be sentenced on, but that was a big one. Was there any indication why she took a break?
No, and honestly, a lot of us sat there very confused as to if she was coming back. The Burness family got up, went back to a room. We didn't know if they were coming back either. So it was strange. We all sat there for about 15 minutes, just not sure what was going on next.
15 minutes later, the judge comes back into the courtroom and then sentences him on the other charges. And then what happened after that?
So she asks first the prosecution if they have anything they want to say. And they asked her to run the sentences consecutively, not concurrently. And then she asked if the Burness family wanted to say anything, and they did not. Then she turned to the defense and said, R.J. Parker, defense attorney, would you like to say anything? And he said that he wanted the judge to know that it was an honor getting to know Bryan Patrick Miller the last 8 years that he had been working with him. And when he said that, there was an audible kind of disgusted gasp from the Burness family. Like, how could he be saying this? It was an honor to get to know somebody convicted of these horrendous crimes for 8 years. That was the first time I heard them express any sound during that. We were also behind the Burness family, so we couldn't see their faces for most of this. But that you could tell people were shaking their heads and they were angry. And then the judge said, Bryan, do you have anything you want to say? And he said, quote, thanks for listening to everything we said and giving us the opportunity to try and convince you otherwise.
And that's it.
That was it. No, I'm sorry. Nothing about the victims. Nothing at all. That was the second time now he would have had the opportunity to show some more remorse, to say sorry for what he did. Didn't take it.
So at that point, the proceeding is pretty much over. How was he let out of the room?
I think he was just taking out that regular door.
Side door there.
Yeah, the side door. There was no reaction really from him. And when he said that to the judge, it was pretty basic. You certainly would not think the person who just said that to the judge had been sentenced to death. There wasn't a lot of emotion from him. At one point, R.J. Parker put his hand on his back, comforting him, but you didn't see a whole lot of emotion from anybody, really. And then he was taken out the side, and that was it. But I do want to talk about the death sentence because it's unusual. If you guys have been following this podcast, we had kind of set up this whole trial with the fact that we didn't really know the outcome because there were so many different factors, including what laws were in existence in the 90s. So interestingly enough, the death penalty laws changed between Angela and Melanie's deaths. So Bryan was sentenced to death for Melanie Burness's murder by lethal injection. However, for Angela Brasso's murder, he was also sentenced to death, but he will get to choose between lethal injection or the gas chamber. And that's due to a law that was in existence in 1992 that changed in 1993. And because Angela's murder was before Melanie's murder, he will get to choose how he dies when it comes down to it.
Wow. And so we don't see this very often because this crime took place 30 years ago.
Right.
30 years ago for Burness, 31 years ago for Brasso. So that's why there's this choice in the death penalty. That's odd. I have to think that at some point between now and if he is executed, when he's executed, this might be hammered out and he may not have a choice, but who knows? So after a death penalty case like this, there's an immediate appeal, an automatic appeal filed. R.J. Parker's office is working on that appeal right now. I was told yesterday by by his supervisor at the public defender's office. They had asked that Miller be kept in the jail for some time, and the judge said, no, he is going to DOC immediately. So he immediately was taken to the Department of Corrections, presumably to SMU 2, Special Management Unit 2, which is the home of death row. And that is a big change for him. That is his home for the rest of his life, unless he wins some kind of appeal. What was it like afterwards? So the gavel comes down, the proceeding is over. Where did the people go and what happened?
So the Burness family immediately went to a room behind the courtroom, and then they were eventually let out a different door. They did not want to talk to media about this, and they'd flown in for the sentencing. Everybody else filed out the regular courtroom door, and people kind of stood around for a little bit, just almost digesting what we had all just witnessed. The fact that after 8 months of trial now, there was an ending and he was sentenced to death. I think there was some conversation about the fact that he'll get to choose. That was different. We don't normally see that. I specifically went up to Troy Hillman, the detective who helped solve this case through working with the forensic genealogist and leading that undercover operation. And we ended up doing an interview with him after. And he felt that justice had been served, but he also brought up the fact that there were other victims that they believe, and he does hope at some time that they also see their days of justice, because we don't feel that Brandy Myers, she didn't get her day in court. Other potential victims haven't seen their day in court. So Troy was careful in talking about that, but also pointed in the fact that there's more to go here. And if it'll ever see the light of day, I don't know. But he did get pretty teary-eyed when he just said, I'm happy for these families that this is over, but I'm so sorry you lost your daughters like this.
Yeah. This was not a stereotypical court proceeding. The whole trial was different. It was just the judge. There was no jury. We've talked about that 100 times. But even the end, oftentimes when you cover a big case like this, afterward, the prosecutor will come out and make a couple of statements, and the defense attorney will come out and make a couple of statements. In this case, nothing. No.
I did talk to the prosecutor, Vincent Bordino, right after. He said he was going home because his wife was going on a cruise and he was going to go spend time with her, and he didn't do any media interviews. I think he was feeling pretty good after the end of this, but he didn't do any media interviews. And then R.J. Parker also did not do any media interviews. So we really didn't hear from anybody but Troy Hillman, and that's just because we knew him. So he was willing to talk to us, but that was different. A lot of times you do see the attorneys talk. You often might see family talk who have been a part of this, and there just wasn't any of that.
Well, that is it for that trial part of it. Although you and I are still going to be trying to get some additional podcast episodes, because now there are people who were involved in the investigation. There are other people who are free to talk to us, and we are going to be wrangling these key players in to talk more about how he was caught, more about the victims, and maybe some of these other cases that were not prosecuted that he might be connected to.
Yeah, so likely more to come on the podcast. But as far as the Canal Murders trial and the end of this chapter, it's wild that we're here. I mean, we've been talking about this trial since the beginning of October of last year, and we are now in mid to late June. So it has taken a better part of this past year. So I just thank everybody for coming along this journey with us. I know it was a long one. There was a lot of information, and it was a lot to process, but we have the ending. It's the death sentence for Bryan Patrick Miller, and that is the end of the Canal Murders trial. So thank you, everybody. We'll have other updates. We're also working on another podcast season that's going to be coming out soon on the True Crime Arizona podcast, so we look forward to having you guys for that. Thank you. True Crime Arizona, the podcast, is hosted by me, Brianna Whitney.
And me, Morgan Lowe. It is a production of 3TV, CBS 5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.